Hi everyone and good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Kate and I'm the Senior Digital Marketing Manager here at Moorepay. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of furlough and what HR options you have once the scheme comes to an end on the 30th of September. Before we begin, I'd just like to go through a couple of things in regards to from a housekeeping point of view. If you've got any questions today, there will be a Q&A at the end, but please pop them into the chat throughout and as I'll say, I'll mention them to Michelle during the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. If you do have any difficulties with sound or anything like that, please again pop those messages into the chat box and I'll endeavour to help you during the session whilst Michelle is running through the actual webinar today. This is being recorded and there will be an email sent out later on today with a YouTube link and a copy of the slides as well, just so obviously you've got that for reference in the future. And then finally, in terms of the structure of the webinar, I'll begin with a quick overview of Moorepay. For those of you who aren't familiar with us and who we are, I'll then pass over to Michelle. And after the main body of the content and the session, we'll go to a Q&A, as I say. So feel free to pop as many questions as you have in the chat and we'll endeavour to answer them throughout the session, or should I say at the end of the session this morning. So very briefly, for those who aren't customers or know about Moorepay, in short, we provide payroll and HR software and managed services. We've been around for more than 50 years and have over 10,000 happy customers across the UK. We promise to make payroll and HR easy, and we do that by focusing on the delivery of 4 key things to our customers: a simple onboarding, software that's easy to use, but that has rich functionality, and flexible services delivered by a team of dedicated payroll and HR experts. But moving on, I'd like to introduce our host this morning, Michelle Hobson. She is our HR Services Director. She joined us in 2017 and she runs all of our HR services teams over at Moorepay. She has over 15 years experience in both operational and strategic HR and is CIPD qualified. So you're in great hands this morning for her to run through the topic on furlough and what happens at the end of the scheme on the 30th of September. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Michelle. As I say, pop your questions in the chat box and we'll endeavour to answer them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. So, furlough. After supporting businesses for 19 months now, we're coming up, the coronavirus job retention or the furlough scheme is going to end on the 30th of September. All claims for September must be submitted by the 14th of October and any amendments must be made by the 28th of October. I think it's probably a bit strange to think that prior to March 2020, furlough was certainly not a well-known word or concept in the business world or within the HR world. It was something that wasn't really talked about, and it has become part of everyday language now, almost akin to when you talk about Googling things and you're talking about people being on furlough. And it's almost hard also to believe that it's been sort of almost 20 months. But this is going to be a big change. In the same way that when furlough was introduced back in March 2020, this was a huge, big deal for all the businesses that had such an uncertain future. And it was a lifeline for some of those businesses. What does this mean now? And what can companies do about it? Obviously, your first option is really just to simply bring employees back to work on their pre-furlough T's and C's. But what happens if that's not an option for the business? If your business is unable to return employees to full-time work, what are the options? Some businesses may still be struggling to return all of their employees because work and their business may not be back to pre-pandemic levels. And what we're going to talk about today is the options that's going to help you hopefully minimise redundancies for those furlough employees. But if that does become the only option, then we can help you sort of think through that and mitigate any risks. So on to the next slide then. One of the first things that I want to talk to you about is private furlough. So once the furlough scheme ends, this is the end of the government furlough scheme, but some employees may choose to introduce their own private furlough scheme. And it's a form of non-statutory layoff that's not covered by existing legal provisions, whether that's paid or unpaid. There's a lot to think about with private furlough though. Obviously, the scheme that has been in place has been a government funded furlough scheme, but there is still the option for you to have this going forward. But simply imposing private furlough could be breaching your existing contracts, particularly any kind of implied terms that you have. It can also be quite tricky if some staff are chosen to work and some staff are being asked to agree to private furlough. So what you need to remember is that new furlough scheme contracts under a private scheme would have to be agreed. Your existing furlough scheme arrangements were all to do with the government scheme. So if you were wanting to put a private scheme in place, this would have to all be renegotiated in contracts. And you'd certainly need to seek advice before you do that, whether that's through Moorepay if you're one of our customers or from your HR support. And the things that these agreements would cover is hours employees will be working, if any, and what they will be furloughed, the length of the arrangement, notice required to bring them back, whether they're allowed to take on other paid work, whether there are any restrictions on then taking other paid work, for example, working for a competitor, and what happens if the government guidance changes and the arrangement needs to be varied. So it could be in the future that lockdown happens again. We're all hoping it wasn't, and the government are giving us indications that that really would be a last resort. But if it did happen again and the government reintroduced the scheme temporarily, what would that mean? How could you reintroduce that? You'd also need to think about things like entitlement to annual leave. I think it's safe to say that any agreement to these variations would need to be given with a signed copy of an agreement letter, so you've got everything documented, and you must ensure that those who are selected for private furlough are certainly selected fairly. Without this government grant, though, it is safe to say that this could be a costly option for employers, because you are solely funding this. So whilst it is an option, and it may be one you wish to consider, I'd certainly seek advice before you did this one. On to other options then. The next one that I want to talk to you about is redeployment. And if we go on to the next slide, sorry, Kate. Thank you. So talking to you about redeployment then. So redeployment essentially means moving an employee to a different role or a different part of the organisation. If you're talking about redeployment in general, the new role doesn't need to be similar to the original role. It can have different duties, be in a different department or location, can have different pay, and can have different levels of seniority. And you can decide to redeploy for various reasons, and one of them could be end of furlough. But there are potential legal risks around changing employment duties unless an employee agrees. The employee is going to need sufficient information about the alternative role and allow them time to make an informed decision. Employees may only agree easily if they're being paid at the previous rate they were, and if they are going to get training and upskilling if it's something they haven't done before. If numerous staff are being redeployed, because there might be one area of your business that is more prosperous at the moment than another, and you're looking to redeploy people, whether that's permanently or temporarily. If you're looking to redeploy a number of people, sometimes an option is just to have an actual overall redeployment policy to help achieve consistency, looking at when and where and why employees may be redeployed, what their rights are, do they have a right to accept or reject that alternative, and what to do if an employee refuses. Again, if you are looking at redeployment or a particular policy, I would certainly seek advice on this. One thing I do need to call out, though, that if redeployment is arising as a result of trying to avoid redundancy, which may be the case with people returning from furlough, they may be returning and the work that they are doing has ceased to exist. If you are looking at redeployment in terms of a redundancy situation, then you really need to be careful around meeting the criteria about it being suitable alternative. So this really is the caveat to the second bullet point on here, which is saying it doesn't need to be similar to the original role. If you're talking about this as an alternative to a redundancy situation, there is criteria around it being a suitable alternative. And all of these, particularly around redundancy, but it'd certainly be good practice for all redeployment, is to keep written evidence of the decision-making process. Keep notes around things like agreements, Usually employers cannot redeploy staff without reaching an agreement with them. So there should be written confirmation to all changes. The length of that redeployment, is it for a specific period or is it permanent? The time that employees could have to consider their redeployment, any training that they may need to undertake, support, induction. As with most employee relations cases, written evidence and the thought process that you as a business has gone through, it's really important to keep all those notes should you be challenged further down the line. But redeployment is certainly an alternative option to a redundancy. On the next slide then, there are various options around changes to terms and conditions. And in general, by agreement, employers can implement new working arrangements, which would mean changes to their terms, to an employee's terms and conditions of employment. But it can only be effective when it's agreed to by both parties, and that implies to any employment contracts too. So it's always best to try and consult and agree those changes first. But I think in the same way when furlough was introduced, we as a business obviously saw a huge uptick in businesses ringing us for advice around furlough. And we imagine that we will see the same as furlough comes to an end, where a business is trying to think what to do next with employees and they're potentially not back to pre-pandemic levels. We expect we will see an uptick in calls again. And that's the kind of thing that Moorepay or your internal HR teams are there to do, to help you look at what alternatives you've got. But I think looking back to March 2020, one thing we did find is that there were very few employees who disagreed with furlough because they knew that this was the alternative to potentially losing their job by way of redundancy, because there was no work at the time because of the businesses that were closed down. And in the same way, if you're bringing employees back, there probably is an understanding that things aren't quite the same as they were before. And if you're looking to do things to try and mitigate the risk of them losing their roles, then that is kind of a good place to start. But the sorts of things that you could look to change in their terms of employment, and these are just potential options for you. You could reduce the hours in a working week. So it could be that they work less hours in a week. You could look to change them to a minimum hours or a 0 hours contract, which allows you to kind of keep them as an employee, but without that specific so many hours a week. You could look at a temporary or permanent reduction in working days for all employees. Alternative working patterns, so it could be they could work 1 week on and 1 week off for the foreseeable future. You could look at things like reduced bonuses, or it could just be things like recruitment freezes, salary freezes, or salary reductions. And they're all options that you could think about, which would allow you to keep people in employment just on slightly different terms, which counteracts any kind of detriment that you're still facing after the pandemic. But the big thing I talked about before was consultation. And this is about ensuring employers and employees discuss those proposed changes. Employees must be kept well informed during the implementation process of this. If changes like this are to be successful, then keeping them informed and keeping them up to date. If there is inadequate consultation, then that could cause problems further down the line, because there's kind of a break of trust and confidence between the employer and the employee, and that could lead to potential tribunal claims further down the line. Another option to look at, which is something you may not have considered, is a sabbatical. Now, sabbaticals, it's not a defined legal concept, but it refers to an extended period of leave which can be partially paid or unpaid. Now, some of your businesses may have sabbatical policies anyway in place, and this, it could be used for a number of things, whether an employee wants to take some time off to focus on a different area of their life, if they want to take time off to travel, they want to take time off to study. You may have had requests for sabbaticals in the past, but it is something that you can consider offering out to employees now as a way of kind of getting people to volunteer to delay their return to work. As I said, though, it isn't a legally defined concept. You need to remember that if a sabbatical is paid, then usually the contract remains in force, which means the employee's continuity of service is preserved. During unpaid sabbatical leave, the contract of employment often does not remain in force, but the employer could decide that the employee's continuity of service may be preserved, and that might make it more attractive to someone thinking about that they might want to take it. And there certainly are some benefits to an employer if the contract continues. So, for example, the employee will retain a duty of good faith towards the organisation and would not reveal confidential information. You'd still have some control of it. You'd also have to have an agreement that the employee would not work without agreement for another employer. And where that employment contract continues, the ongoing contractual benefits can be negotiated between the parties. So if you're talking about benefits, overtime, what will that look like? There'll be lots of things to consider. It's often worth having a written sabbatical policy that sits alongside any sabbatical agreement you've got with individuals, and it's something that you may want to consider. And some of the top tips to think about when you're writing a sabbatical policy and agreeing a specific sabbatical agreement with an employee is deciding how long the leave is going to last for. How long are you going to allow them to last for? Is it a month, 3 months, a year? What will that look like? Who are you going to offer it to? Is it just a certain area of your business? Is it an option to all staff? If you get too many requests, how are you going to decide who gets it and who doesn't? You need to clarify what employment benefits come with it. So, for example, if people have health plans or they have a company car, what's that going to look like during the sabbatical? And you also need to get agreements. There's one thing that you certainly can't do, which is force anyone to take a sabbatical or unpaid leave, because these arrangements are entirely voluntarily, taken entirely voluntarily. So if you're asking people to take a sabbatical, then make sure that it comes from them. On to the next slide then. Another thing that you could consider when looking at your overall business is around secondments. So essentially, employee secondments are where employees are temporarily assigned to another part of the organisation. So this is where one part of the organisation is experiencing an increase in demand, and another area is seeing kind of a lull, which may be the case when people are returning from furlough. So rather than looking at redeployment, you might just look to impose secondments on people. I think in normal times, secondments we tend to associate with things like career development for an employee, or kind of looking at temporary increases of workload. But in these current times, secondments may actually help avoid redundancies. So as I said, if you've got one area of the business that is busier than another's, a secondment may kind of buy you time whilst the economy is getting back on its feet. And these can be to the mutual benefit for both employer and employee, and could include things like development for the employee. So it's definitely an area that you could consider. But you need to consider, again, the following, and all these are very similar. You need to look at things like agreement, getting the employee to agree to a secondment, why the secondment's there, what benefits are they going to get for it, how long is the secondment going to last. This is usually only for a set or fixed period, and that should be known from the beginning. What are the terms and conditions going to be? What is the payment going to be? How does this affect their continuous employment? And what does this do to the overall employment relationship? I think during secondments, the employer usually retains the normal employment relationships in terms of how things work. But it's just important with all of these to make sure that up front, everybody knows where they stand and what the options are. That was kind of a whistle-stop tour through some other options, but you will be able to get a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides after this, so you can review them at your kind of leisure and at your own pace. What I wanted to do was just give you a flavour of the things that you could think about, but you know, being kind of very blunt about it, if none of those options are suitable for whatever reason, and you have talked these through with ourselves at Moorepay or your internal HR teams, and none of those are suitable for whatever reason, and you are looking at a redundancy process, for employees who are potentially returning from furlough, then there are lots of things that you need to consider. And I think it's worth calling out that, you know, obviously as we are moving through this pandemic and we are still in the thick of it at the moment, in terms of how this lands in employment tribunals, in terms of law, we are still in very early days of this. So we as a team at Moorepay work very hard to make sure that we stay on top of the changing legislation of how this impacts. Oh, sorry, the slide slipped off for a minute, but I think we're okay.
Sorry about that. I've just set them up again. Will be a second.
Yeah, no problem. I'll wait till it's back up. So we were on the redundancy process one.
Yeah.
Sorry about that slide. Yeah, no problem. I'll carry on, and whilst the slides are coming back, I'll carry on. So yeah, as I was saying, you know, we are still working through this, and things are changing all the time in terms of what we know about employee relations related to anything to do with COVID, to do with furlough, to do with redundancy that happens because of the end of furlough or because of COVID, and we are learning all the time. But that's what our team at Moorepay are kind of working tirelessly on, and have done since the pandemic started, is keeping ahead of those situations so that we can help our customers kind of make sense of it all. But in general, we know what a redundancy process looks like, and a typical redundancy process would require a genuine redundancy situation with a robust business rationale. Always remembering that a role is being made redundant, not a person. It's the role that's being put at risk, not that individual. You'd look at how an employer consults with his employees, what fair selection procedure is put in place to decide who is and is not being made redundant, and what alternatives are there. So obviously we've kind of talked about alternatives in general, but still, when you're going through the redundancy process, you need to record what you have actively considered could be alternatives to avoid a redundancy dismissal. If we think back to March 2020, the job retention scheme was implemented with the primary purpose of helping businesses avoid redundancy. We had a lot of calls in those first couple of weeks before the furlough scheme was announced, but we knew the way things were heading, from businesses that were worried they'd have to make immediate redundancies. They were looking at short-term layoffs, how that would work. And this furlough scheme was put in place to help avoid this. But the truth is that for some employers, this scheme has only maybe just delayed what an inevitable fact is. The fact that an employee has been furloughed does not prevent an employer from implementing a redundancy after the scheme has ended. But if you need to place an employee at risk, then you need to do it in a very robust way. It's important to remember that just because an employee has been on furlough does not mean that you have got an automatic rationale for making them redundant. You will still need to look at the whole organisation. Who has still been employed during this time? What jobs do they do compared to the people who were on furlough? And make sure that you are not, I guess, kind of treating the people who were on furlough any different to anybody else that you've got in your organisation. Remember the special rules that apply to collective redundancy where 20 or more roles are affected, and make sure that you're using a decent selection scoring method, a matrix, using key factors that can make you decide, help with your rationale of your decision, and again, sort of seek advice on this whilst you're doing it. There is that robust process that we follow that people are familiar with and have been using for years, but we've just got to view it through the lens of people returning from furlough, which takes us on to the next slide, which is just to really call out that staff should not be selected for redundancy solely because they've been on furlough. This may give rise, not even to just it being unfair, there could be discrimination claims unfair dismissal claims that come in. So it's really important that you take that into account. It's not uncommon for employment tribunals to challenge whether a genuine redundancy situation exists and whether the dismissal could have been avoided. So that's where the robust procedure comes into place. And do remember that if an employee has been furloughed, their redundancy pay will be calculated on their normal pre-pandemic wage, not the reduced furlough wage. And no part of the furlough grant can go towards paying redundancy pay. An employer is duty bound to pay that redundancy pay themselves. As I said before, it's just important to note that this is still, 20 months down the line, this is still an evolving area and employment law, and we don't have the benefit of case law that has gone before us. We're starting to see some things sort of come through now, but the tribunals themselves are very behind with hearing cases, and they're sort of even now only hearing cases that were registered pre-pandemic. So there may be some indications that we're getting, but we just need to tread that extra bit careful. It's not to say that these things can't be done, but it's important to make sure that they're done, they're robust, and you have sought the right advice about what that looks like. So the next slide then talks about the redundancy checklist, and I won't read through all of these, but it's good for you to glance through. And I always think a checklist in these situations is really good for employers to look back and think, have I gone through all these steps? Could I answer all these questions? And these are the sorts of questions that a HR professional should be asking a business at the time that they're thinking of making redundancies. I think overall, looking at the whole topic, because I am conscious that I want to leave some time for Q&A. Again, I said I know I've rattled through some of this, but it's good to be able to give people the chance to ask their specific questions. I think the end of a furlough scheme presents opportunities, if we look at it in that way, for businesses to consider what they do going forward, what their business operations look like. They can look at working hours, greater flexibility. There are businesses who are saying that everyone's going to work from home, or that they're going to come back into the office in a hybrid situation. There is lots of opportunities, and in some ways it can be seen as an opportunity, and it may provide the chances for employees, for example, who've been on furlough and reduced hours. They may want to make a flexible working request to work reduced hours on a reduced pay. And there'll be lots of questions that people have got. But for other businesses, the end of furlough may inevitably mean having to make decisions about what their business can sustain in the near future and in the long term, and whether that's looking at one of the options around things like secondments, redeployment, a private furlough scheme, or is it looking at a redundancy situation because where your business is at the moment, you know that is not going to change in the near future, and therefore you have to make changes to ensure that your business can sustain itself. So you may be in that situation where you are looking at making redundancies, but you need to recognise the cost implications, and have you considered all the alternatives. But I think it's just important to sort of finish on saying, whatever the outcome and whatever challenges your business may face with the end of furlough and the uncertainty that business owners and business managers will be feeling themselves, the biggest thing is communicating with employees. If you're bringing employees back from furlough, even if you are simply able to bring them back to their kind of pre-pandemic life, T's and C's, pay, job, etc., you still need to make sure that communication with them is absolutely critical. You need to respect the concerns, the fears, the anxieties of those who are returning to work after a potentially such a long absence, support them, and then look at supporting people who are potentially in a redundancy situation, and also compare them to those who, for want of a better phrase, survive those redundancies. Kind of put yourself in the shoes of all those affected. We are still living in strange times. There's still lots of impacts that COVID is having, and by the looks of it, this is going to continue. But I think sort of the upcoming end of furlough is going to be quite a pivotal point where businesses are being, making decisions now on what it looks like. So think and consider about all the things we've talked about on this webinar. and then make sure you seek advice on your specific situation, because whilst we can talk generically, there's always a nuance to the situation that you have, and you should always check that out either with Moorepay or with your internal HR specialist. And over to Kate now for questions.
Brilliant, thanks Michelle. So yeah, there's quite a few dropped in, so I'll just work our way through them. So a couple of the questions are, with regards to the private furlough scheme, does it only apply to people who are still on the scheme when it ends on the end of September? And also, does it have to continue to be the 80% that it was on the previous furlough scheme?
What I would say with a private furlough scheme is that because there are so many elements to consider, and if you are implementing this as your own scheme, you, to a certain degree, have the ability to make some of those decisions yourself. So the way the furlough scheme was set up by the government, if you think back, it has changed over the time frame from being a certain amount, and then we went on to flex furlough, different levels of contribution. So furlough in itself from the government has changed. So there aren't specific rules that you would need to implement for a private furlough scheme, and that may include that you can furlough someone who has not been previously furloughed. But it's really important for, well, it's important for all of them, but this one in particular, that you seek advice on how to implement a private furlough scheme. Obviously, we have helped a lot of businesses implement the government furlough scheme, but in the same way, we would need to talk to you as a business or your internal HR team and build out what that contractual change would look like, because there would be no contracts at the moment that actually have a talk about a private furlough scheme. So it'd be something that would need to be decided and introduced, and all those kind of questions answered at point of implementation. But it is quite an expensive option.
Brilliant, thank you. So next question is more about the sabbaticals, and it says, can an employer, can you agree in a sabbatical that they can work for another employer during that time, or is it a legal requirement that they can't work during a sabbatical?
Sabbaticals are not usually given to people so they can go and work somewhere else. The point of a sabbatical is that they are taking time away from work to do something else. If you are looking at allowing them to work somewhere else, I would suggest that you'd look at one of the other options. And one of the things that we didn't really talk about on there, but was something I mentioned briefly at the beginning, was about layoffs. And a certain amount of, kind of short-term layoffs, or if you had the private furlough scheme, you may agree for them to work somewhere else. But I would suggest that a sabbatical should remain what it's intended for, which is the chance for them to do something else, whether it's to study or it's to volunteer somewhere. I would say that sabbatical should remain for that reason, and you should look at one of the others if you are wanting people to not attend your work but allowing them to work somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. And then someone else has asked about a secondment. So when you talked about that, is that kind of a temporary option, whereas a redeployment could be a permanent move into another area of the business for someone that's returning?
Yeah, usually redeployment would be for a permanent redeployment. You can do redeployment on a shorter term basis, but redeployment would normally be, we've assessed the kind of the needs of the business, and there's an option for you to redeploy into another area because the area of the business that you're working in doesn't have sufficient work at the moment. Where we've all know about secondments before, and a lot of the time it can be for sort of career development. I don't know, in the past it could have been someone's gone on maternity leave for a year and you advertise a secondment to fill their position, somebody else internally can move into it. So that's how I treat the two differently, so that redeployment is generally more longer term, whereas a secondment is an opportunity for development, but it's just letting you know that that is an option in these circumstances. You can kind of turn it into a positive, an opportunity for them to learn new skills. And if you're hoping that they can come back to their original role, at some point, because that's one thing you need to do, is say what's going to happen at the end of that secondment, and be clear from the beginning what you know is going to happen at the end of that secondment. So I'd treat the two separately.
Brilliant, thank you. And then someone's asked, what's the implications if a furloughed member of staff decides they want to actually retire when they're returning from furlough at the end of September? Is there any rules or implications that they have to follow?
Not necessarily. I would suggest that you follow the normal retirement process that you have. As I said at the end, kind of maybe people being on furlough has changed their mindset around their working life. Like, you know, you may get people who say, actually, I'm ready to retire. If they've been on furlough for quite some time, they might think, right, I'm ready to retire. Or they may think, do you know what, I have been used to being on 80% of wages, I can go down to 80% of hours, and therefore I'm going to put in a flexible working request, for example. But in all those situations, you would just follow your normal process. So here, you would just follow your normal retirement process, and go through that in the normal way.
Brilliant, thank you. And then someone's put, if someone's returning from maternity leave, and they've got no hours available, but the person returning isn't keen on that, would they be considered, or should they be considered for redundancy? Or could they be considered for redundancy?
They could be considered for redundancy, but what you'd have to look at is what type of job they are doing, and who else in the organisation is doing that job, because there are protective rights for people on maternity leave, to make sure that they're not unfairly treated purely for the fact they've been on maternity leave. So what I would do in that instance is speak to someone about that specific situation. If they just do a job that no one else does, and that job either doesn't exist anymore, or there's a significant reduction in work, then it may be a bit more straightforward. But I would still make sure that if you are looking at making a redundancy where someone has been on maternity leave, that you speak about that very specific situation to an HR professional to make sure that you are not giving yourself rise to a sex discrimination claim.
Okay, and then someone else has asked about the whole redundancy package, and if their hours have been reduced from the 1st of October once the scheme's ended, and then they're made redundant, presumably will their redundancy package be allocated on their previous hours, not the reduced ones?
If they are coming back to new terms and conditions, it will depend on kind of where you make them redundant, and at what point after that, because what you've got to make sure is that if you kind of know they're going to be made redundant quite quickly and you reduce their pay, because if you're reducing hours, you're reducing pay, that's not seen as kind of making them suffer a detriment. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how far back they go in terms of looking at what the pay is, because if you're looking at statutory redundancy, obviously there's a kind of, it's either what your wage is or it's capped. If you just take note of that, Kate, I will come back to that question individually when I can see what the exact time frame is. But I just want to call out that you've got to make sure that if you think you're going to make someone redundant, kind of don't try and preempt a lesser redundancy payment. That would give rise to a kind of a tribunal calling you out. But I will, let me just see if I can find it. I've got something here. Okay, I've got it. I knew I had it somewhere. So weekly pay is the average pay that you earned per week over the 12 weeks before the day you got your redundancy notice. So for example, if someone came back on the 1st of October and you reduced their hours and therefore reduced their pay, and you made them redundant in February, they would get it on their new hours. If you were making them redundant at the end of October, you would have to look at pre-pandemic pay. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't remember if it was 6 or 12 weeks, but that's what I was looking for, but it's 12 weeks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michelle. So someone else has asked about, just bear with me. Someone's asked a bit more about layoffs, and is that something that the employer should suggest, and are they generally paid or unpaid?
Short-term layoffs are something that would come from an employer, and you hopefully a lot of employers have that in their contracts already. But the first thing you'd need to look at is, do you have that contract that available in your contract? But basically, this is where an employer is asking an employee to stay at home, take unpaid leave if there's not enough work for you. A layoff is at least 1 working day, and there's no time limit for how long you can be laid off or put on short term, but you can apply for redundancy and claim redundancy pay if it's been more than 4 weeks in a row or 6 weeks in a 13-week period. There's kind of a lot of nuances around short-term layoffs and short-term working. The two go hand in hand. And if you're unpaid, you are entitled to guaranteed pay as well. I would again suggest that you seek clarification on that, but it starts with an employer suggesting it. You need to make sure it's in the contract, and you need to be aware of kind of all the caveats around it, that they are all around a short-term solution. So it's anticipating that work will pick up in the near future.
Thank you. And then someone's asked about they've signed some furlough, so flexi agreements, and looking for consulting for alternatives in place, but they won't be in place by the end of September when this scheme ends. Can they carry on with furlough under the current terms until they figured out what the flexi/private scheme will look like?
Well, as the scheme ends at the end of September, I'm kind of guessing what this question is, but as the government scheme ends at the end of September, then the scheme's gone. That, you know, it's done and gone. If you're looking at putting a private scheme in, you need to have that in place for the 1st of October. You can't, or you move them on to layoffs if you're not ready for them to come back. So again, I would seek clarification from an HR professional on exactly what your options are, but do just remember that that scheme is ending, and that's ending full stop, the government scheme. So if you wanted to keep them on a similar scheme, it would have to be under a private scheme, and they would have to know the details of that before it started. If you don't think you'll have a private scheme in place, or you decide that you don't want a private scheme in place and you're looking at alternatives, if you're not going to have them ready for the 1st of October, then you need to look at something like a layoff. And I would sort of advise you to seek advice as soon as possible.
Fantastic, thank you. And then the final question is, someone's asked, if we are to reduce working hours on an agreed basis, should this be a permanent change or a temporary one?
It depends on a number of factors. If your business can predict when there's going to be an uptick in business, and you're quite confident that can be a temporary reduction, then most certainly you can go ahead and do that. I suspect though that that's going to be quite difficult for businesses, so it may be more prudent to put it in as a permanent change and explain that it will be reviewed as and when business starts to change, or put review points in. Again, seek some clarification. I know I'm saying this a lot. It's more because there's so many nuances to these and so many areas of law you need to consider that you just really don't want to fall foul of any of those, and you need support in getting those bits right. But unless you know that it is going to be temporary, and you're predicting that, I don't know, by the 1st of December, because if you're in the restaurant trade, you're going to tick up in business because of the Christmas trade, I think actually we're just going to do short term reduced hours till December, and then you'll all go back to your normal hours. Other than that, it's probably worth it being a permanent change, but perhaps communicating that you're going to put regular checkpoints in.
Brilliant, thanks Michelle. So there's no more questions. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for attending today and taking the time out of your busy schedules. I'd also like to thank Michelle, and as I say, all the questions have been answered. So just to wrap things up, I'd like to point you in the direction of Moorepay's Knowledge Centre, where there's a whole host of information on various payroll and HR topics. You'll find things like our employment law and legislation guides in the resources section, as well as lots of topical blogs written by our experts. We do share these on our social media channels, so if you are following us on LinkedIn, you'll get to see them. Again, I hope you found the webinar today helpful, and thanks again to Michelle for hosting and answering everyone's questions. I'll now close the webinar down. Have a lovely day, and we'll follow up with the slides and recording later on this afternoon. Thank you.